In 1865, a British surgeon named Joseph Lister lost half his patients, not to the operation itself, to what happened after: a clean cut, a successful surgery. Then, days later, death. Doctors called it hospital fever. Nobody knew what caused it. Some blamed bad air. Others blamed the patient's own constitution. Nobody blamed the doctor's unwashed hands. Surgeons operated in the same coat for years, crusted with old blood. A stained coat was a badge of experience, not a warning sign. But here's the part that rarely gets explained well. Humanity had survived infection for thousands of years before this, not by curing it, by managing it, blindly, without understanding why. So how did anyone survive a cut, a birth, a simple fever at all? The textbook answer is simple. They didn't, mostly. People just died. You already accepted that answer. It is only half true, because survival rates, while brutal, were not purely random chance. Certain wounds healed. Certain treatments worked, oddly, consistently. Ancient Egyptian medical texts prescribe moldy bread on open wounds. Sumerian tablets recommend beer soaked in specific fermented herbs. Medieval healers packed wounds with honey, sealed tight, and waited. None of them knew why. All of them, somehow, kept working. That is the real question this video is built around. Not, did people die from infection constantly? They clearly did. The question is, why did some remedies actually work at all? Not magic. Not superstition alone. Something chemically real. Honey, it turns out, is naturally hostile to most bacteria. Low moisture, high acidity, and enzymes that produce hydrogen peroxide. A wound packed in honey becomes an environment bacteria cannot survive. Nobody understood microbiology. They understood results, repeated for centuries. A treatment that worked got passed down. One that failed got forgotten. This is natural selection, applied not to bodies, but to remedies. Every surviving folk cure is a treatment that beat its competitors. Thousands of other remedies existed. History simply let them die out. What survived into medical texts was already, unknowingly, filtered by results. Every ancient cure, at its root, is an accidental controlled experiment. Take mold. For centuries, moldy substances treated wounds across cultures. Serbian and Greek healers used moldy bread specifically for infections. In 1928, Alexander Fleming noticed mold killing bacteria in a petri dish. He named the substance penicillin, and modern antibiotics were born. But the mold itself had been treating wounds for over 2,000 years. Fleming did not discover the effect. He explained a mechanism already used. This gap between using something and understanding it defines most of history. People were not ignorant. They were running experiments without a theory. A theory explains why something works. A practice just needs it to work. Practice came first. Theory arrived, in some cases, thousands of years later. This changes the entire picture of pre-antibiotic survival completely. It was not blind luck versus modern medicine's certainty. It was slow, brutal trial and error, refined across countless generations. Every successful treatment represents thousands of unsuccessful ones, forgotten. The cost of that refinement was almost unimaginable, measured in lives. A single village might lose a third of its children before age 5. Infection, not violence, not famine, was the leading cause of death. A splinter, a tooth abscess, a scraped knee could become a death sentence. This is why pre-modern medicine treated infection with such extreme fear, not overreaction. Accurate risk assessment, based on brutal daily experience. Consider childbirth, one of the deadliest events in pre-antibiotic life. Puerperal fever killed new mothers within days of a successful delivery. Doctors moved directly from autopsies to delivery rooms, hands unwashed. In 1847, Ignaz Semmelweis noticed a pattern nobody wanted to see. Wards where doctors washed their hands had far fewer maternal deaths. He could not explain why. He simply enforced the practice anyway. Mortality dropped by more than half almost immediately after the change. His colleagues rejected the idea. Invisible particles seemed absurd to them. Semmelweis died in an asylum, ridiculed, decades before germ theory was accepted. The solution existed before the explanation. Nobody believed it without one. This pattern repeats constantly throughout pre-modern medical history. Effective practices, dismissed for lacking a scientific story to justify them. Quarantine is perhaps the clearest example of this exact pattern. Venetian officials isolated ships for 40 days during plague outbreaks. The word quarantine literally comes from the Italian for 40 days. Nobody understood bacteria or viruses. They understood that distance saved lives, isolate the sick, and the healthy survived at dramatically higher rates. This crude, brutal practice remains a core tool in modern epidemiology. The mechanism was invisible. The pattern of survival was not. Pre-modern medicine, at its best, was pattern recognition without theory. A fixed treatment does something else, quieter, easy to overlook entirely. It gives a community a shared, testable response to an invisible threat. Without a consistent practice, every household improvised, and most improvisations failed. Communities without shared medical knowledge suffered dramatically higher death rates. There was no reliable way to know which remedy actually helped. A shared practice, repeated across generations, slowly filtered out what failed. You could try a treatment here and see the same result decades later. That single fact enabled something new. Cumulative, transmissible medical knowledge. Historians find remedies recorded almost identically across separate, unconnected cultures. Willow bark, used for pain and fever, appears in Egyptian, Greek, Chinese texts. Independently, cultures rediscovered what we now call salicylic acid, aspirin's ancestor. That is not coincidence. That is convergent trial and error, engineered by necessity. Convergent discovery requires many generations testing the same available materials. That process needs a fixed point knowledge can accumulate around, safely. Historians of medicine have a name for this: empirical tradition. A body of knowledge that exists not from theory, but from repetition. That kind of tradition may be humanity's oldest form of science. Pre-modern medicine did not just treat symptoms. It built a method, not metaphorically, structurally. This is a testable claim about knowledge itself, and it explains something modern medicine still quietly relies upon today. A fixed practice also solved a problem pure theory alone could not. Roughly 1 in 3 children died before reaching adulthood, historically. Most of those deaths traced back to infection, not injury or violence. Survival only improved when practices spread faster than infections could kill. That required constant, communal transmission of knowledge, not individual genius. So medical knowledge could no longer live only in one healer's memory. Part of every community became dedicated record keepers of what worked. This is one of history's earliest visible divisions of specialized labor. Not a wealth divide, a knowledge divide between healers and everyone else. Ordinary families relied on trusting a healer's accumulated, tested experience. Healers relied on families reporting honestly what treatments succeeded or failed. That mutual trust needed a shared, remembered body of practice both sides accepted. Medicine became a contract, written in outcomes instead of explanations. You could not verify the mechanism. You could only verify the result. Break that trust, and entire communities reverted to dangerous guesswork. This is why traditional remedies were rarely abandoned without a proven replacement. Every new treatment had to outperform generations of tested folk practice. Some remedies, like willow bark, persisted for over 2,000 years, layer upon layer of confirmed results, across cultures, across centuries. A remedy can outlive every single person who ever tested it. There is a fourth, more uncomfortable truth in this entire history. Most trial and error medicine came at an enormous, largely invisible human cost. We do not have records of the countless remedies that failed outright. Survivorship bias hides thousands of years of quiet, fatal experimentation. Every remedy that survived stood on the failures of countless others, which means someone had to keep trying after watching treatments fail repeatedly. That kind of persistence is not recklessness. It is necessity disguised as hope, belief that some remedy, eventually, would beat the odds against infection. Long before germ theory had evidence, disease already demanded desperate experimentation, a belief that says, something here must eventually work. That belief is the true ancestor of every clinical trial ever conducted. Risk in early medicine was rarely about certainty. It was about probability, not guaranteeing survival, but improving the odds, slightly, generation after generation. That distinction is the seed of epidemiology, pharmacology, and eventually modern medicine. None of it required germ theory to already be functionally true. The scientific explanation came later. The practical method came first. Every antibiotic ever developed is a translation of that earlier persistence. Fleming did not invent the idea of mold-fighting infection. He simply explained a mechanism people had already been using for centuries. And once it could be explained, something else became possible: precision. Picture one specific afternoon, In a London hospital, in 1865, a surgeon prepares for an amputation, hands stained from the last patient. A young assistant hands him instruments, wiped on the same cloth as before. The patient, feverish already, watches the ceiling, saying nothing. Nearby, Joseph Lister reads a paper on fermentation by Louis Pasteur. Pasteur suggests invisible organisms, not bad air, cause decay and disease. Lister begins soaking instruments, wounds, and dressings in carbolic acid. His colleagues mock the method. Invisible creatures seem like superstition to them, but his patients' infection rates begin dropping, sharply, consistently, undeniably. Within a few years, his mortality rate falls from nearly half to a fraction. The hospital does not immediately celebrate him. It slowly, reluctantly, adapts. By the time he retires, antiseptic surgery is simply standard practice everywhere. This is not a dramatic story. That is exactly the point. Nothing extraordinary happened, because the method eventually proved itself, quietly, repeatedly, not brilliance alone. A theory that finally matched centuries of practical results. That match between explanation and practice is the actual turning point. Carbolic acid, honey, mold, quarantine, all of it just delivered the same idea. The idea itself needs no single material to already be true. Every antibiotic you have ever taken inherited that long, uncertain history. It is older than germ theory, older than the microscope, older than chemistry. Fast forward to now, and the idea has not changed at all. Modern medicine still does the same core job, just far more precisely. It identifies what actually works, now called clinical trials instead of tradition. It filters out what fails, now called peer review instead of folklore. It transmits knowledge reliably, now called medical journals instead of oral tradition. It still relies on testing against an invisible threat no eye can see. Modern pharmacology, stripped down, still runs on this same old process. A new drug still requires years of trial before earning trust. That is the folk remedy logic, formalized into rigorous, regulated experimentation. A treatment that fails consistently still gets abandoned, just far more quickly. That is the survivorship logic, compressed from centuries into carefully designed years. A properly used antibiotic still changes how safely a person can heal. Studies on antibiotic resistance link overuse directly to declining effectiveness, not carelessness alone. An actual measurable erosion of a fragile advantage. A recent study found resistant bacteria emerging faster than new drugs can counter them. The mechanism your ancestors solved with scarcity, you now risk losing through excess. The system did not invent the threat of infection. It just changed the odds. Antibiotic resistance, stripped of headlines, is a return to the pre-modern threat. Except now there is no 40 years of folk trial to fall back on. No accumulated backup remedy. Just bacteria adapting faster than medicine can respond. This is not a policy lecture. It is a return to the mechanism. Every antibiotic crisis is, underneath the headlines, a broken trust in scarcity problem. The caution that once needed constant painful reminders now needs conscious discipline. Regulations, prescriptions, global health bodies, modern stand-ins for slow folk wisdom. None of them invented the threat. They just inherited the responsibility for managing it, which means the danger itself was never fully eliminated. It was only suppressed. It was never really about defeating infection permanently in the first place. It was always about staying ahead of a threat that keeps adapting. Every generation just rebuilds that advantage with whatever tool is available. Yours happens to be built from chemistry, regulation, and fragile global cooperation. So here is the question worth sitting with for a moment. When you take an antibiotic for a minor infection, what are you actually doing? You are not just curing an illness. Curing was never the whole story. You are spending down an advantage centuries of desperate trial and error built. You are trusting a system that only works if used carefully by everyone. That trust only works if the discipline behind it is real to enough people, which is why unnecessary antibiotic use quietly weakens a shared, fragile inheritance. And careful, targeted use still preserves the advantage for the next crisis. The medicine was never the whole point. The discipline behind it always was. Somewhere behind every prescription you have ever filled, that old scarcity still lingers. Not literally, but structurally, in the exact same place in the system. The part that decided, once, whether an infection could actually be stopped. You inherited that fragile advantage from people who buried children to earn it. They just found mold, honey, and distance, and it was enough to begin. Today, you will do what they did, with tools they never could have imagined. You will trust a treatment without ever needing to watch it fail first. That is not a modern convenience. That is the oldest debt medicine has. It just took thousands of years to look like a pill in your hand.